everybody. Welcome to La Lista, a Latinx writers podcast. My name is Ruben Mendive, and I have a special guest here with me today. I always ask my guests to introduce themselves. So who you are, how you identify, and whatever that means to you. So I'll let you take over.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kryzz Gautier. I am an AFRO-LATINA Writer director.
All right, cool. And the second question I always ask is, where are you from? Like, where are you from? Where's your family from?
I was actually born and raised in the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
My parents still live there, don't speak a word of English. Have to call them every week and break out the Spanish and sometimes also the Google Translate because I go so long without speaking Spanish.
Yeah, it's like, ¿cómo se dice?
Yeah, all the time. Like, half of our conversations is like, ¿cómo se dice?
Yeah.
You just have to figure it out by context clues. Yeah.
I always like to get like a backstory on the person of like, who are your parents? You know, what's their story? What about your grandparents?
Yeah. So it's very, very interesting. I think my family has informed a lot of who I am, both as a writer, and I know that that's the case with everyone, but I think for me specifically, there's a 30-year gap, almost a 30-year gap between my parents. So my dad turns 80 next year, and my mom's in her 50s. My dad was married until I was like 7, and so now they've been together for longer than their age gap has been, but for a very long time, specifically when they got together the first time since my dad was married. And it was the very typical, like, my dad was a big executive and my mom was like a clerk in his company. And, you know, there was that whole affair and all these things. So there was a lot of resistance from my dad's family until he eventually kind of like settled down and moved in with us and kind of went through the divorce. So there's been a lot of, like, my background has been like very contentious and that, and like very dramatic and very telenovela in that way. So the drama comes naturally to me because I was just kind of raised in that environment. Yeah.
And what did your parents do for work?
So my dad was a huge financial executive, and my mom was a clerk. So one of the things that my dad did, it was kind of like I don't know how you call them in English, but in Spanish you call them financieras, which is like kind of smaller banks, and that's one of the things that he did. So the story of how they fell in love, it sounds super fake, but my dad signed all the checks, and my dad has a really intricate signature. And my mom says that every time she would see a check signed by my dad, she would be like, I bet the man that has that signature is a very interesting man. So she fell in love with his signature before she fell in love with him. Cool. Yeah. And then they met, and my dad was married, had other kids and all that stuff. And then I came along.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was, then she became a homemaker.
And can you tell us about like growing up in the Dominican Republic, you know, and like just what your childhood was like?
Yeah. I think my childhood was also very different than most people because unfortunately the day that I was born, my mom had an allergic reaction to the anesthetic that they give her for the C-section. So it basically messed up her spinal cord, and she hasn't been able to walk since the day I was born. So I also grew up in kind of this role as a caretaker where my mom was in a wheelchair and I had to assist her, and that came with a lot of other kind of health issues and things like that. So from a very young age, I became also kind of a support system for her. But at the same time, she also kind of made it her mission to always be present and be the mom that was at every bake sale and that was at every school event, even though she had a disability. And she did it like a champ. And I think she's told me multiple times, and I've heard her talk about it to other people, is like she never wanted me to feel like she didn't have legs. So that was kind of like growing up, that was a very different childhood for me than most kids had. Because of that, I also became an only child to my parents because she could never have other kids. So it was like me and my mom, and I remember like me playing at home would involve me getting in my mom's wheelchair and like racing down the hallways and like playing with myself and making up imaginary friends and all these things. So I think that's a lot where that background of creating worlds and things like that was because of my mom's health situation. I never had siblings my age or in our home because my dad does have kids, but they're much older than me. Like my dad has kids older than my mom. Yeah. So there's a huge age gap. There was never anyone. I tell people that I'm an only child because there was never like that relationship or any difference or any closeness in age. So I just grew up kind of as a caregiver and an only child, trying to like relieve myself of a lot of the drama and things that was happening around me by writing and doing all these things. And I think writing was sort of an escape growing up for sure.
Yeah. And like how much of the drama were you aware of, you know? Because it's like did you know like what your parents' relationship was, or why it was like not like everybody else's, quote unquote, you know?
Yes. So I'm kind of about to put my parents on blast here, but yeah, my dad had children that were older than me, and like I said, he was married until I was about 7, and my dad was so brazen about it. Bless his ego and his manly macho Latino thing. He would take me on the weekends to his wife's house, and I would call his wife mommy, her name, whatever it was. So
that's bold.
He was bold. He was brazen about it.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And he would he took me to family functions, and he enrolled me in the same school as his other kids. So everyone knew who I was. Everyone knew that I was the other child. And there was a lot of drama about it. And I saw a lot of feedback, and I would come. My dad would take me to family functions, and my mom, I distinctly remember this, one day, and I've heard the story as well, I would come back and ask my mom in Spanish, obviously, be like, Mom, what does whore mean? And Mom would be like, what? Oh, I heard someone calling you a whore. And I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. So, and I also remember like playing in my dad's briefcases and finding letters that people had written him, like people from his family being like, leave them. What are you doing? They're destroying your family and all of these things. And I was like 4 or 5 and just like learning how to read. So it was like I was very much aware and very much in the middle of it, and very much affected by it to a certain extent. I mean, I know that they tried to hide me from it, and they tried to keep me aware as much as you can when you're directly involving your other child in your family. But yeah, I was very conscious of everything that was happening for sure.
Yeah. Oh God, that hurts my heart. Like truly. Just like having a little kid like that has to like, you know, it's, Did you say where exactly from the Dominican Republic you were from?
The capital, Santo Domingo. So,
and how would you describe it to someone that's never been there?
Oh my God, it's the most colorful, vibrant, crazy, homey place that you can go. I came here on a student visa, and long story short, I was undocumented after that for 7 years. So I haven't been home in 10 years, and I haven't seen my parents in 10 years. I only got my green card about a year and a half ago, and I just haven't been able to make it back for different reasons. So I don't know. I keep hearing that it's very different now. But when I was there, it was just... I never wanted to live there because I never felt like I belonged. To me, the dream was always America. And I went to American school my whole life, and that's why I don't have an accent, and no one believes that I'm from the DR or I'm a foreigner because I don't sound like a foreigner. So it was like I very much grew up bicultural, which I was, we came every summer, and my dad had business here, and we traveled a lot, and I spent Christmases here, and like my dad would bring me to see Barney at Radio City Music Hall in New York just for like a weekend trip, whatever it was. So I very much grew with entrenched in the two cultures. So to me, the DR never really felt like home. But now that I look back at it, I do remember it being an amazing place to grow up, even if I couldn't appreciate it back then. So as an adult now, I see it for the it's just so rich of a country and of a culture, and we have such an amazing background because we have all those cultures that came together in an island. We have the oldest city in America because we're the first island where Columbus landed. And our colonial zone is World Heritage Patrimony place. We have the first cathedral in America. We have all these things that were the first ever in this side of the world. So you can go 10 blocks one way and you'll see buildings that can rival downtown Miami, and go 10 blocks that way and see buildings that are 600 years old.
Yeah.
So just very much like I was, that I grew up bicultural, I think the city feels that way a lot. So also the gap between the rich and the poor is immense. I remember when I was growing up, we had the first IKEA in Latin America, and we had the first Bentley dealership and the first Maserati dealership and all these things, because when these places are looking up to open stores in Latin America, they do market studies. They're like, there's so much money in the Dominican Republic that obviously that's where we're going to start. But then you see things like someone asking for money, knocking on a Maserati window. And that's kind of like, there's barely, I think we got ahead of the United States on there not being any middle class. So it exists to a certain degree, but the gap between the rich and the poor is just very, very big.
Yeah. So I always like to talk about, you growing up in like high school. And I always ask people, like, who were you pretending to be, and how did people see you?
That's really funny. Now I'm putting myself on blast. I was kicked out of 3 high schools in 4 high school years.
Okay.
I was an intense kid. And it was funny because you would look at my grades, and in the DR you have a grade for conduct, which is behavior. And you would like go down the list of my grades, and it would be like 95, 100, 95, 98, because my dad wouldn't accept anything but A's. He was very strict about that. And then you get to conduct, and it was like 20. So it was like I would be acing all my classes, but be a demon child. And it took my first school, the one that I was in my whole life, so long to kick me out, because they just couldn't justify it until things actually like went crazy at one point, because I was like an A student who was just a horrible kid. So who was I in high school? I partied a lot. I had a lot of friends. I was never not popular. I mean, I know people who hate high school. I would go back to high school in a heartbeat. I loved it. I had so much fun. And I also think a lot of people who are queer struggle with their identity, especially coming from these type of countries. My parents never knew I was queer, or I think my mom was in denial for a while, and I think my dad just never registered as a possibility. But I think my mom suspected for a very long time. But I was never in the closet at school. It was never a thing. Like, I always talked to guys about girls, and we always like, guys knew when I had crushes on girls, and if I was a freshman and one of the hot seniors that I had a crush on would walk into the school, you would hear everyone go, "Whoa, she's here, Chris," blah blah blah. So it was really weird looking back at how close-minded my society is, the really natural experience that I had in high school, where I was never pretending to be straight, and I was never pretending to be anything I wasn't, because I was lucky enough to just kind of always be myself. So it was very natural to me to go to high school outside of just being a terrible, misbehaved child. I was like a very happy child and who had a lot of fun.
And what would you describe like misbehaving? What was the low scoring conduct or like a reflection of? Just an example, just to be like, because I mean 3 schools kicking you out, it's like.
And the last one was basically, it was they did technically kick, my parents don't know this. They did technically kick me out in junior year, but I was like, just let me graduate. Like, we have 1 more year. Let me get it out of the way. Just like, let me do it. But I've always had a problem with authority. I don't like people telling me what to do.
Got it.
And I think teachers, I love arguing, very contrarian.
Yeah.
And one of the things, for example, I remember when I was in middle school, if kids didn't want to take math, they were like, we don't want to deal with math today, they would like pull together 5 pesos or 10 pesos or whatever and like come give me some money and be like, argue with the teacher, we don't want to have class today. And I would spend the entire hour arguing, just bugging the hell out of the teacher and just like being an awful kid, and we wouldn't have math that day. And
that's a unique, it's like an A student, but like you also are getting kicked out of schools. It's like, it's like an interesting dynamic between those two like polar opposites.
Yeah,
because it's not, you never think that's the same kid,
And it was very much me, and a lot of my friends too. It was, we would constantly get kicked out of class, but then come in and ace every test and do every homework and have the best project in class. And it did come in because in my house, I got a lot of whoopings for my conduct grade. But academics, especially for my dad, who at one point was a college professor and, came and did education here in the U.S. and was a very successful man who came from nothing. To him, education was really big, and nothing but 100 was accepted. And you could get 500s and 190, and that 90 would be an issue. It'd be like, but okay, Dad, I got 5 of them. Why are you complaining about the 90? Well, all 6 of them should have been 100. Yeah. That kind of thing. So I think that was my little, also like form of rebellion of like me going against my dad. It was like, middle finger to you. Like, I'm giving you everything you want in every other way, but this is my own little world where I'm going to do whatever I want. Yeah.
And so like, what did you do after high school? Like, was there a plan, and like, did the plan go according to plan?
I've always known that what I was going to do. I knew that I wanted to be a filmmaker when I was like 5, and then I wanted to be a director. I knew that the school that I wanted to go to was Emerson when I was 13. It was the only school I applied to when I went to college, got accepted because I spent years preparing and knowing what they were looking for in the portfolios and things like that. I also, when I was a freshman in high school, it was either 8th grade or freshman in high school. I can't remember which. There wasn't when I was growing up any real narrative television in the Dominican Republic. What we have is a lot of kind of shows in the vein of The View, and imagine if you mixed Good Morning America and The View and Dr. Phil and all these things into one. There's a lot of those like little shows that are just daily variety shows, but then you tailor them to specific demographics. So you have like the lower class shows, and you have the shows for the younger audiences, which were the ones that I grew up with. And one day I told my driver, because I had drivers that picked me up from schools, and my mom couldn't drive and my dad was at work. They had people who like drove me around. I was like, take me to Teleantillas, which is the network that the show was on. And I was a brazen little kid. I went to the desk and I asked for the producer of these shows. And I was like, I want to talk to Tuto. I knew his name. His name was Tuto Guerrero. And she was like, I was like literally in my school uniform. She's like, who the fuck are you? And I was like, I want to talk to Tuto. And she was like, he's working. What are you doing here? Go home. And I was like, I'm just going to sit here until I see him. And I sat in the lobby of the network until I saw him come out, and I approached him and I was like, listen, I want to work in TV, and you make shows that I love, and I want to learn from you. Because his family is kind of like a legacy family in television that have had shows for years. Yeah. And he was like, what? And I was like, I'm not leaving. I want to work with you. I want to learn from you. And he's like, just follow me. He was like walking and talking to people, and he just took me behind the scenes on the network. And by the end of it, he was like, yeah, sure, come back tomorrow. I don't know. And that's how I started like being a PA on 2 shows. Well, that was like just the one show. And by the time I got in, the 2 shows were like back to back. I think one was at like 4, the other one was at 4:30 or something like that. Within like a month, I was working on both shows. Within a couple of years, I was like giving my own little segments to produce. And by the time I graduated high school, I was like full on producing things for the shows. So my days would be go wreak havoc at school and then be dropped off at the network, work for like 2-3 hours, and then go home and do homework. Yeah.
And what did your parents think of that? Of you like working in television, producing stuff? Like, what? It
was, my dad never really understood it. To my dad, it was a face, because he's very much a numbers guy and a finance guy and a business guy. And to him, art was never an option. I didn't start college at Emerson until 20, because for 2 years, my parents were like, no film school. Like, do something reasonable like marketing or graphic design, and then when you have your degree, then you can pay your own way to film school. Like, you can do whatever you want, but have a quote unquote career first. And I was like, it's either film school at Emerson or nothing. And I think they thought I was bluffing for a while. And I was like, cool, I'm just going to stay here for a year and let's see what happens. A year passed and my dad was like, so you're not going to go to college? And I was like, I told you I'm going to film school at Emerson. You decide if you want to get behind that or not. And I think when the second year came around, he was like, okay, I guess she's really not bluffing.
Yeah.
And he gave in. So I was like a freshman at 20 at Emerson because for 2 years I just like sat with my arms crossed in my house being like, I told you what I want. You decide if you want to let me do it or not.
Yeah. And where did like that vision to go to Emerson, to even start working in television, to producing, where did that come from? Like where was the seed of that?
I've always been a storyteller. I mean, I think, like I said, my dad didn't move in with us until I was about 7. So for a long time, it was just me and my mom in a house. And my mom, obviously her caretakers would come in and also assist, but a lot of them would just like leave at 5 or 6. And then for the rest of the night, it would just be like me and my mom. And she would be in a room watching novelas or Primer Impacto or whatever. You know, they were obsessed with. I wasn't allowed to talk during Walter Mercado and all that. So I'd have to like go do something else during whenever my mom was watching all that. And I'd have to entertain myself because I didn't have anyone else to play with. And so I started making up worlds and stories and imaginary friends and things like that. So from a very early age, I had that writing down. But then also my dad had a camera. He had a Canon camera with an array of lenses that any photographer would be jealous of. Like my dad had a full camera kit for when we went on vacation and that. So very early on, I got behind the camera with photography, and I got my own camera pretty soon after. And I started being able to connect the stories in my head in a visual way, because I would like arrange my teddy bears and I would take pictures of like the frames of the stories and all these things that were happening. So very early on, I was able to connect stories audio visually. And by the time I was 5 or 6, I already knew that I wanted to be a storyteller and that I wanted specifically to be a director. So I started doing research, and I knew that Emerson is one of the top 10 film schools. And I knew that that's where I wanted to go. And I started tailoring resumes and extracurricular activities and everything that I needed to do to get in, and kind of made it happen.
And so tell me about your experience at Emerson. Like, what was it like?
Oh, it was amazing. Again, it's one of those things where I would go back in a heartbeat. I had so much fun. I met some incredible people that are always going to be a part of my life. Like my business partner, Brett, who's also my writing partner, is incredible. And we met. So, you know, sometimes colleges have floors, you know, how like this floor is the healthy living floor and this floor is the sober floor or whatever. So we lived in the 11th floor of Piano Row, which was one of the buildings at Emerson, and that was the film floor. And in that floor, I met so many incredible people. One of them, who to this day is like my business partner, Brett. And I think I started to form a community just on my floor. And then it expanded from that. I was involved in every extracurricular group that you can imagine. I ended up being the president or the vice president, I think, I can't remember which, of the photography club at Emerson. And I was involved in like the National Broadcasting Society, and I was involved in the Emerson Channel. And I was involved, like I would have 6 hours of classes and then 8 hours of meetings after classes, because I was involved in like every club you can imagine. And I was on set and I was doing all these things. And I had a great time. I think it's, I understand when people say you don't need film school, and I understand that it's not for everyone, and my student loans now hate me for having made that decision. But I also wouldn't change the experience, because I think it's so formative. I think there's things that you just can't learn outside of film school. It doesn't matter how much real world experience you have. It doesn't matter how many sets you work on. There is, and even if it's just being 18-year-old kids sitting in the common talking about all the movies that you love, that you just spent 2 hours discussing in your history of media arts class or whatever it is. I don't think there's anything that can replace that experience. And is it worth $200,000 in student loans? Debatable. but I mean, I still wouldn't necessarily take it back.
And I also think, you know, if you're someone like you who like goes into it knowing exactly like what you want to get out of it, what you want to build from it, then I think it's also like great because then you have the facilities for it, you have the equipment, you have the collaborators for it.
Exactly.
So you can just like work through it, meet people, like, so yeah, I think it's also good for that. But not a lot of, I don't think most people go in with an exact plan. I think they sort of figure it out along the way.
As they go, yeah.
And that can sort of hold you back a year or two before you like actually realize what you want to do. But I think if it's like very beneficial going into it, like, yeah, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to get out of it. Like, and you mentioned that you were there on like a student visa.
Yes.
So like, can you sort of talk that process out just for people that aren't familiar with how they work? Or
yeah, definitely. So basically, when you're coming into the United States with a student visa, you first of all have to have the admissions letter. So you have to have an accredited school being like, yes, we're allowing this student in. And in order to get into a school in the US, first of all, you have to take the SATs, the PSATs, the TOEFL, which is the proficiency test in English that proves that you have at least basic understanding of the English language and you can defend yourself in an English college, in a university or school that's primarily in English. Then you have to bring in proof of finances. So basically you go to the U.S. consulate with your approval letter, plane tickets, proof of finance, which means this is how I'm going to pay for 4 years in school.
Yeah.
And that is hard a lot of the time for international students because I paid for school with loans that were co-signed by my grandfather. So he lives here. He lived in Puerto Rico. He passed away recently. And it was hard because I had to apply, or actually we were in the process of getting student loans when we had to come into my appointment. And my dad finagled, like, borrowed some money to put in his bank account so that we can take it bank statements to prove that we were going to be able to afford it. But it was like someone else's money. And then we obviously, he had to return that. And then I had to like get student loans to actually pay for my schooling. So then every year you get it for 4 years if they do approve it, but you have to every year get signatures by the school that you're still in school.
Yeah.
And you have to have like presence letters and all these things. It's like a very, it's very archaic in the sense of they do control everything you do, and the most minimal infraction, like they put the fear of God in you. Because if you get arrested for jaywalking or whatever it is because you're here on a visa and you're supposed to be at your best behavior, you can get your visa stripped for the smallest thing. So after you get your degree, which could be an AA, a BA, a PhD, whatever it is, you get what's called an OPT, which is, I think, optional practical training. And I think for an AA or for like diplomas or things that are not necessarily a BA, you get either 3 months or 6 months. But if you get a BA, you get a year. So I was eligible for my OPT once I got my degree in 2012. And then a lot of complicated things happened, but I got rejected for my work visa twice. And then, so I get rejected the first time, and technically your status, from what I understand, is supposed to freeze when you go either appeal the decision or apply again. So yes, they rejected me a second time, but theoretically, I shouldn't have gone over to like automatically and overstaying my visa. It should have frozen while I did the second round of application because you can't apply another time. But when they sent the rejection letter the second time, there was a paragraph on the letter that basically said, why are you still here? You overstayed your visa like we told you to leave last time. And at that point, once you overstay your visa, you're never allowed back in. So they were like, you need to leave within 14 days. And I remember calling my parents from outside my lawyer's office and being like, look, this is what happened. They're saying that I overstayed my visa. I can't leave now. I mean, it's like I can come home, but if I go home, I give up everything that I've wanted to do my entire life, because now there's some sort of film industry in the DR because Pinewood built a studio there in Punta Cana, and Netflix is going to shoot there now, and there's like a lot of productions and things happening now. But back then in 2012, 6 years ago, that really wasn't a thing. So I was on the phone with my parents when I pretty much told them, like, I guess this is it. I've been here undocumented technically for a year now, and I'm going to be undocumented until I figure it out.
Yeah.
And after that, I was undocumented for about another 5 years, I think. And the last big project that I did, my career was on a really huge upswing. I had a manager, like representation within 6 months of graduating school. The last big job that I did was work in the production office of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I was doing I was in the studio system at that point, where I was getting jobs with big producers and big line producers, and I was getting into more on the production side, because I also do production as well as like writing and directing. But that's always been like, producing always pays more money than writing and directing.
Yeah.
You know, that's a whole other ballgame. But I was starting to get traction as a producer, and then I had to automatically switch track and go into the indie world, because you can't, like, my visa lapsed while I was working for Fox, and which is the studio behind Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. And I remember getting a call from the accounting department being like, your papers aren't valid. And I was like, no, my lawyer is working on it, like, we're applying for it. And I remember, like, they didn't know that I had already gotten my rejection letter, but I brought in my application letter, which means, like, theoretically my papers were still in process, and but they didn't know that I had already gotten my rejection and been like, you need to leave. So that kind of like put a standstill on my career for about 5 years. And it's the reason why I haven't been home in so long and haven't seen my parents and all these things. So I had to make a hard left into the indie world and kind of live there as a writer and a producer. And like I said, I had a manager, and I kept getting jobs as a director or offers and things like that. Even outside of my manager, I would get tapped to direct an indie feature, and it would start here in Los Angeles. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, there is better tax incentives in Atlanta, so we're shooting in Atlanta now. And I'd be like, fuck, I can't get on a plane. So that's where I would have to make up a story to drop the project, be like, my grandpa died and I have to leave for personal reasons. I have to back out of the project. And losing my legal status cost me quite a few jobs as a writer and a director and things like that, because I would get all these opportunities, and then it would come down to, you have to sign a W-4, which is where you have to do proof of employment, and I'd like have to like back out, be like, fuck.
Because you know, I was born in Mexico. We were undocumented for a while too. And even now, you know, I'm a citizen now, and even now I just started this new job and had to fill out like the W-2, the W-4, the actual proof of like you verify verify that you're supposed to work here. And like even now with this job, I was like, oh wow, like this truly is like you having like a valid like social security number or green card or or the other one, I forget what it's called, really means like whether or not you can even have this job. Like and
so basically, so I always had, because when you work on campus or when you're here, you get issued a social security number. So I always had my social security number, always paid my taxes. That notion that immigrants don't pay taxes is bullshit.
Because a lot of the times with that, it's like, I hear that a lot where it's like, well, they pay sales taxes, and it's like, no, we fill out
taxes.
The taxes are like I turn them into the IRS. Like the IRS is fully aware of
where I am
and cashing in all the money. Like they have no problem with that. Like they just like truly, like if you wanted to see how like that find undocumented people, you would have to go to the IRS and be like, who's what doesn't line up. But no, they don't do that, because who cares? They're getting paid.
Right. Exactly.
But yeah, it is like we paid our taxes. Like my parents have always paid their taxes.
Always, every year.
Every year. I was in high school paying taxes and like filling out forms. So it's not like I think a lot of people, for some undocumented people, it is like under the table work and it's cash. But it's like there's a lot of people that have are working in offices, have W-2s that are paying taxes to the government every year.
Because, and that was me. I was one of those people, because I would get, as long as you don't have to fill out a W-4, you're fine, because the W-4 is what requires you to do the proof of employment. So there's companies that only require you to sign like a W-9.
Yeah.
Or you only fill, or if it's under, like, if I was working on set and you get paid less than, I think 600 is what I think it is. So if you were working for the weekend,
Yeah.
and you're working for 2 days for minimum wage or whatever it is, you don't really have to fill out any sort of paperwork. But you still get a 1099 at the end of the year that you have to report on your taxes and do all these things.
Yeah.
So I distinctly remember there were 2 full-time jobs at really big companies that I went in for interviews, because I would still like shoot my shot.
Yeah.
I would go into interviews and I would do my thing, and I was like, maybe they won't make me sign a W-4. Maybe it's just a W-2 or a W-9 or whatever it is, or a W-9, not a W-2. And I would get offers, and then I would go to HR and be like, this is a stack of paperwork you have to fill out, and there'd be a W-4 in there, and I'd be like, fuck.
Yeah.
How do I reject this full-time job now that they just offered me? Like, who am I going to kill? What family emergency that I need to leave the country now?
And did you ever think to just like do it anyway? And like,
well, I can't, because when they try to verify you as a potential employee, you're just not going to pass.
Yeah.
So it would always have to be me turning it down for some magical reason and having to walk away from a really great job with benefits and things like that.
And how did it feel to have to do that for like a number of years, especially coming out of school, like having some traction, really like hitting the ground running, how you're like truly the way you're supposed to do it, like you were on the track to that. And then how did it feel for a number of years to just like have to like do that just maneuver in ways you didn't think you had to?
I mean, as you can tell, I've always been very goal oriented, and I've had to suddenly like see myself on the track that I was supposed to be, and out of nowhere be thrown into this completely different world, where as a side hustle and to just like pay rent, I've had to do, outside of like anything illegal like selling drugs or like being a sex worker or anything like that, I've done everything you can imagine. I was the caretaker of a 94-year-old with dementia for about 1.5 years. I've worked in food trucks, I've worked in restaurants, I've done like dishes, and like, so anything you can imagine. Like, I have a college degree, and I'm going to like, there were several years where I would like be on the phone with my manager talking about a very big deal that they were putting me on for, like a movie we were producing. We were meeting a financier in a couple of hours, and I was like in a food truck like making fries and shit like that, because I needed to pay rent somehow. So that was a thing for a very long time. So I've had to juggle the day job and the industry job for quite a while, and I became a pro at it because of my immigration status, and because for some time, I mean, when you're a freelancer in film, you can do very well for 3 months and get a huge paycheck from a production, and then not work for 4 months. And then you have to pay rent in those 4 months still. So what are you going to do? And then that's where, like, fuck, I'm going to go wash dishes, and I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to do that, while still keeping up with the grind and writing every day and taking meetings and, you know, networking and going to events and making short films and doing all these things. So it was an interesting experience, and it just, I think it also makes you a better writer, because that woman that I worked with, the 94-year-old, has such an interesting life story, and I worked with her for about 1.5 years as her mental state deteriorated. But I would sit down with her and take notes of her life. And I like told her son multiple times, I was like, your mom's life, your family's life is a movie. Like, they met, her and her husband was at Pearl Harbor. They met right before. She was the nanny. His family was like super rich from Massachusetts, and she was like the nanny that came in one summer to take care of his little brother, and he had a rich girlfriend too. So it was like, again, basically a novela. He fell in love with like the help. His family hated her. And then he went off to Pearl Harbor. He was in Pearl Harbor when it was like being bombed, and they just like wrote love letters back and forth for the entire time that he was deployed. And he came back, and they had children, and they had 2 boys. One of their boys died. And she was just like her entire life, just that summer of when she met her husband and that thing, that's a movie, and I have like notes of conversations that I had with her. And I met some really great people doing other like shitty jobs. So it just like, it informs you, and the more people you meet, and it just gives you stories to tell. So I don't think I would ever take it back. It was a rough period.
And did anybody know of your status? Like, did your manager know?
No, my manager never had any idea. And I think it got to a point, we didn't part ways until about a year or so ago. But we were together for about 6 years, and I was undocumented the entire time that I was with him. And I think at one point he got really frustrated with me because I had to keep turning down jobs that just like, because I've never gone into a meeting I never went to a meeting that he set me up for that I didn't land the job as a director, as a writer, whatever it is. But we never, either by me having to turn down the jobs or just things die in development hell, nothing ever happened. So we were together for 6 years, but not a single project came through. And I think the majority was just like them dying in development hell. But a significant number of them was me having to be like, well, this is shooting in Canada now. So.
And I think even now, within the last year or 2 or 3, I think, like undocumented, just that whole like status has become more aware, and like more people know it. But like 4, 5, 6 years ago, like no, like it just wasn't even like if you like, what do you think your manager would even say if you like? Do you think he would even have the language to process?
No, not at all. I mean, he was like a white guy, whitest guy ever, great guy, but whitest guy ever. I don't think he would have understood. I think it would have been a lengthy process of education and doing things. And I think it wouldn't have been worth it for him. He would have dropped me in a second because he's like, well, you can't work, so bye. And even if nothing came out of it, I formed some really good relationships with people that I met. Other fellow clients of his that to this day I still, I'm in writers groups with and things like that. So I did get a lot of it, even if I didn't get work out of it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, most people in my life didn't know. It's not something that you necessarily advertise.
No.
And not to say that I didn't trust the people in my life, but you just never know.
You can't take the risk.
No. So a lot of the time it was always like, oh, so what are you working on? And I'd be like, just writing and doing things. And meanwhile, I was like working in a food truck, like on the weekends and stuff. But I couldn't justify to all my friends from Emerson and things like that who were like executives and things now why I wasn't working. It was puzzling to some of them of like why I wasn't like at a studio or doing things like that, because everyone knows, like, not to toot my horn, but like I'm good at what I do and all this shit. And it's like people would be like, so what are you working on? Like, are you anywhere now? And I'm like, no, just living my life, freelancing, and doing great. And
you like always had such quirky jobs.
I know.
It's
I was like, I'm just
so eccentric.
I'm producing an indie feature right now that pays me no money, but it's great, covers the rent, so it's fine. And they would always be like so confused. And it wasn't until after I got married that I was finally like able to openly talk. Like the day that I got my green card, a lot of people found out that I was undocumented. And people were like, wait, what? I was like, you just never know what people are going through.
No, and it's like a mind trip. Like, I've had my green card since I was like, I don't know, like 12, and I'm just now starting to like let people know that was how my childhood was, like, but it's like, it's that, like, I grew up with my parents, and it was embedded in me, like, this is like, cannot leave this house, like, this
you can't tell people.
And just how I grew up. And then, but again, you have to like hold a little bit of yourself back, because then people are going to ask certain questions, or like go into a conversation where it's like, well, I don't want to lie to this person, so let's avoid it. And like, I felt really bad because there's people who if I got close enough to you, which was a very intimate circle, they did know. But most people in my life, people I dated, I had no idea. I dated some people for quite a while, and it was like, not that I don't trust you, not that I don't love you, but you also kind of have loose lips. I love you to death, but I don't know who you're going to go telling. And I don't know who that person is and what they're going to do with that information. So we're just not going to talk about it. And, I think we've come, I want to say so far, but not even far enough.
No.
But just like 10 years ago, like, people wouldn't really understand the language, know what it was, and wouldn't know that they're not supposed to tell other people. Like they would just like casually might mention it somewhere, and it's like, oh, you just put my whole life on the line. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Yeah. And I was like, oh.
They didn't know how serious it was, how dangerous to like how your whole way of life is. Yeah.
We live in a society where there's just like there was a Gestapo you know, tip line. There is an ICE tip line.
There is.
Well, you don't have to give your name or you don't have to give everything. You just have to be like, this person is undocumented. Go pick them up.
No. And I've heard like on this podcast, you know, the writer Julissa Arce?
Yeah.
She was on a podcast saying how she had a ex-boyfriend who like she trusted and they were breaking up and he was like threatening to call. And like, that's real. Yeah.
It's been, you know, I think I still don't have my permanent green card. I go for my permanent next year because I've only had I'm in my 2-year green card right now. And still, because it's like temporary and conditional, I'm still just so afraid that it's gonna like get ripped out of my hands one day.
And I don't envy anyone doing it at this time.
Yeah.
Like,
my wife and I had to go in for our interview. Like it's gonna be 2 years in June, and it was just so nerve wracking. And our lawyer, he's one of the best. Put the fear of God in us. They're like, they're gonna show up at your house and they're gonna do all these things. And we literally, so there's like different offices, and based on what he told us, there's some that are worse than others to go in for the interviews. Like San Bernardino is like straight up in Trump country. Yeah. And he's like, oh, that's where your appointment is. They kind of hate the gays up there, and it's just gonna be tricky. And like, let's just try to get it back in LA. And we were like, let's just not wait any longer. Let's go and do this. And our appointment was like 8 a.m, and he put the fear of God in us. Like we thought we were driving to San Bernardino at like 5 a.m. and like rehearsing things that we knew about each other. Yeah. Be like, what's your birthday? Just like making sure that we had all of our ducks in a row, because he made it sound like we were walking into war. And we walked in and we were there, like we were literally the first person of the day. Our appointment was 8 a.m. We were there for maybe 15 minutes. Yeah. The dude was like, so you got married? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, cool. Here you go. Here's your green card. Yeah. We were like, wait, what? We had a spreadsheet of like our names, our birthdays, our blood type, and all these things that we just wanted to make sure that no one just like, I have a terrible memory. Love my wife, know her to death. Right now, I couldn't name all of her siblings off the top of my head. She has a ton of siblings. And it was like, we were rehearsing on the way there just because they'll like think it's fake. Yeah. And they're like, no, it's not. I just have a terrible memory. No, that was our exact experience. And it's like we had the same fear of God in us. And it was bad then when I was like 12. I can't imagine how it is now. Yeah. Because it's like probably double, but it was the same thing. Like my dad keeping us up, rehearsing, like knowing what the information, we were bringing in photo albums. Yeah. Like nervous as hell in the office. They weren't that nice in the office, but again, it was like 20 minutes. Yeah. And it was like, okay, there you go. And it's like, oh, that's it. Yeah, that's it. But like, I still remember that interview. Like it is still burned in my brain. The like rehearsing of it and having to like know the information. Yeah. And it's just like people don't understand that process of like, if I mess up a question, you're going to put in doubt my entire relationship. You could fuck up my life just because I didn't tell you what the right birthday was. I'm sorry. My brain does not work for holding facts.
They did come to our house.
They did?
They did. Yeah. They came to like double check stuff. And so it's not fun.
It's not fun. And people just don't understand. Like people who've never gone through it don't get it.
And anytime I have to like write my social security card, anytime I like have my passport in my hand, or I have to like do the verification for unemployment, it's like all of that just
comes back.
And it's like some people just fill that out and like nothing. Like
they were born into it. They just have no idea what it costs to get it. Yeah. It's crazy.
So let's talk about like how once that process, even though you're still in it, like once it sort of started to turn the corner, like career wise, like,
oh my God, it's the things that I've done. Some people don't believe what the amount that I've crammed into like a year and a half or a year. I now have an agent again. I I've done the Ryan Murphy Half Initiative. I've done one of the DGA fellowships. I'm currently in the Women in Film fellowship called Insight, which is just for women of color. I'm in the Women in Film mentorship program, and my mentor right now is Kat Candler, who is the showrunner of Queen Sugar, and she just got a new show with Ava DuVernay, executive producing it. And TNT, is it? TBS? I can't remember what network it is, but she just got a great new show that she's show running and writing and directing. And I've already pitched at my dream production company. I pitched a feature and a pilot, which they both want to read. I pitched at a major studio a couple weeks ago, and they want to read it as well. So it's been great. What I think I've been trying to play catch up for the years that I've met, so I've like hit the ground running. The moment I got that green card in my hands, it was like, okay, we're doing this now. And I have to remind myself on a daily basis. Social media is kind of like a double-edged sword because you compare yourself, whether you want to or not, of like all those people that I went to Emerson with, where they're now. Executives, huge agents, doing all these things. And I'm like, well, I'm not there when I know that I could be. But then I have to keep telling myself, it's like you lost 6 years. They're there because they were able to do all these things for this period of time where you were basically frozen on ice and you couldn't do anything. So it's a daily battle of when I start to feel bad and I see all these other things that people are doing that I know that I'm just as talented or more talented than, whatever. And I'm like, but I should be there. That should be me. And then I have to consciously make a decision of reminding myself that my circumstances were very different. And that I should be very proud of what I've done in the year and a half that I have been able to work. It was basically like I came out of college and my knees were cut under me. So it's like, in very many ways, age-wise, I'm like 23 in terms of my career, even though I'm much older in real life. And it's because I couldn't do the things that I wanted to do for so long. So right now, 2019 has been a year of a lot of planting, a lot of networking, a lot of events, and a lot of pitching, where I think 2020 is going to be the year of like reaping a lot of that. And I have my agent who's great. And now I'm in the process of like trying to get a manager and like meeting people who are going to make some introductions, who are currently reading my work and are going to get me into agencies or managers that are going to refer me to people who they think I'm a better fit for as a writer and a director. So I think 2020 is kind of going to be the year where my career actually is like, okay, this is when we're actually going to take off. And it's like also a lot of people, and this is also like an industry-wide problem, like a lot of these fellowships and like programs, it's like those also require you, like a lot of them also require you to like have a green card, have some sort of citizenship. So it's like, and that's I think something that, like, that's why when I say we've come far, it's like we've barely just crossed over. And there's still stuff where it's like, well, do you really need to like be a U.S. citizen to be in this fellowship? Like, there's stuff where it's like we have to like adjust that because there are a lot of people who are still like undocumented, like filmmakers, writers, directors who are still on ice. And it's like there's very easy things that could be done just like industry wide where that isn't a barrier for entry for people. And I think obviously there is a reason why, and one of the reasons is because even though when I was in the DGA fellowship, we had a meeting with the head of diversity and just internally with other directors that I know who have gone through literally every fellowship, female directors who are still not working, even though they've done everything that they tell you that you need to do, which is shadow, get representation, have a body of work. I'm one of them. You still go into meetings and they're like, we love you, love your cinematic language, love who you stand for, great work. We can't give you an episode. It's because even though the turnover rate or the conversion rate, what I meant, is so low, they still think that you might be the one. that's going to get a job out of it. So they have to make sure that the people who come in through the project are ready to like actually start working.
Yeah.
And you can't work at a studio or a network or anything without having to fill out a W-4 and be verified and all these things. So there is that. That is why they put those restrictions on that. But it really is a barrier. Even a lot of competitions, crazy enough, like screenplay competitions and things like that. It's like 18 and eligible to work in the United States. I'm submitting a short.
Yeah.
Why do you need to see my green card for that? I don't understand.
And I'm sure they never do. Like,
right.
I'm sure that people have won that, gotten the money or gotten like the press or the prize or whatever, and never had to like prove any of that.
Right.
But that alone being there, someone's going to be like,
it's a deterrent to a lot of people. I mean, for most of my time when I was undocumented, I didn't apply to anything because I knew that I couldn't get in. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it stifles. We have an entire community of people, 11 million people, who God knows what kind of creatives and what kind of stories are in there that we can't tap into because of the legal system and because of how broken our immigration system is.
Yeah. And then there's and even like you were doing, like trying to like maneuver around it, there's still a ceiling for that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about, your writing, so like just where it started in terms of like, when was it the first time, it was like read by someone, produced, like put up, like, what was the experience of that?
It's funny enough because my identity as a writer, independent of my identity as a director, is something that I very recently discovered. And when I mean very recently, it was like in the last few months. Because I've always directed everything I wrote. So I've never, until very recently, again, in the last few months when I did Short and Sweet, and a couple of other things that have come my way, me as a writer-director has been a single thing. So I directed my first thing when I was like 14, and it's always been that way. I've always written and directed everything. So I saw myself more as a director who writes, who also happens to write. And for a very long time, I only introduced myself as like a director-producer, even though I've written everything that I've directed. Yeah. So I suddenly realized that, no, I am a very competent writer, and I am a writer who can sell things that I don't necessarily have to direct. And that happened a lot when I started to go into meetings and pitching things and talking about things. And people would be like, and what else do you have? We love that idea. What more do you have? I'm like, oh, wait, maybe I'm not terrible at this. Okay, cool. And then I started to kind of see myself as Kryzz the writer and Kryzz the director. So I couldn't even tell you what the first time someone read something of mine was, because...
So maybe I can change up the question. So when did you start to call yourself a writer? Do you remember that, or like the project or the thing that sort of was like, oh no, I'm also a writer, like, or this is like something that maybe was just your writing? Something
I remember. I've always been a writer. So I remember one of my favorite classes was always English/creative writing in school, because the feedback that I always got was great. And I have been thinking about this recently a lot, and I would have to ask my parents if they even haven't, but they probably do because they don't throw anything away. But I distinctly remember a story that I wrote, and I think my mom brought it up in conversation at one point too, a story about an old man that had magic powers. And it was an assignment, a creative writing assignment, probably like 4th grade, 5th grade, something like that. That my teacher pulled me aside and was like, whoa, this is so good. And like wrote on my paper. And so there's like, it's always been there where I can craft stories. And one of my strong points that I think it is, and it's because I feel like as an only child, I've spent a lot of time just listening to people have conversations. One of my strong points is dialogue. And I distinctly remember my teacher writing, being like, this sounds so real, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's always been that. It's always been very early on the feedback that I got from other people of how real things read and how they related to something. And even just in like the scripts that I wrote, the actors, the feedback has always been how real and how grounded things feel. So I think once I learned to detach that feedback from, oh, it's just the work that I do as a director that feels very real, that I understood that I could call myself a writer.
Yeah, and I always ask people this, like, is there like a through line through all your stories? Like, is there themes or is it, or sometimes it's like, sometimes as writers, we're just telling the same story over and over, just in different ways. So is there something that runs through all the different types of stuff that you create?
It's very funny because I think I'm split in half. There's some weird dichotomy to me where the two things that I'm very good at writing are, think about like darker dramas, kind of like Gaspar Noé kind of things, like very gritty Sundance con type of thing. And then my other great passion is sci-fi. I love sci-fi, but not in the like Battlestar Galactica, Star Wars kind of sci-fi. Yeah. But the Charlie Brooker, Black Mirror, Utopia for my TV kind of sci-fi. Yeah. Where it's still very real human stories. So you're telling character-driven stories. There just happens to be some really fucking cool technology around them. So I love creating those like really interesting, intricate worlds where just cool stories between people are happening. So I'm either going to be writing something really depressing or something really depressing with a lot of technology. Those are like my two things. But I think also a theme that carries on throughout my writing is, and a question that I love to ask is a parent's love really unconditional? And I've written quite a few stories, whether shorts or features, about, is that true? Because we were always told a parent is just pristine, and it's just, once they see you, they're going to love you forever, and they're going to put you above everything else, and you're always going to be the most important thing in their life. And I don't think that's true. I was lucky enough to have very great parents, and they did their best in all circumstances, and I'm never going to fault them. But they both came from really broken backgrounds, and I think their parents, for the most part, at least one of their parents, are the very clear example of no, love isn't always unconditional. And I start having these conversations with people, and they're like, oh yeah, my mom or my dad failed me in this way and did this or did that. And just like what you know of what happens in the world. And I think demystifying the idea of parenthood as this pristine, perfect thing where you basically stop being a human once you have a child, and you have to give your happiness and sacrifice yourself wholeheartedly for this one other like extension of yourself and put everything you have into them. I think that's a very interesting theme to explore, and I've written quite a few things about just not unconditional love from a parent.
And you mentioned these like fellowships and like mentorships that you're a part of now, like the Ryan Murphy one. So can you just sort of, for the people that are interested, in, like what has been your like experience of those, and what have you feel like you've gotten out of those?
It's interesting because through the process of doing fellowships, I think a lot of people go into fellowships with some misconceptions, and I was one of them, which you think that getting into a fellowship like Ryan Murphy is your ticket in. Like, you get into Ryan Murphy and you're set. Yeah. And I was just having a conversation with a manager that when they heard that I got into Ryan Murphy, her eyes went wide. She was like, holy shit, you got into Ryan Murphy? It's difficult. The fact that you get in is a testament to your work. And there, just by getting into a fellowship that difficult to get in, you're already being vetted at the highest echelon of the industry. But a lot of people think that just because you get in, that's a guaranteed job. It's not. Out of maybe 80, however many fellows Ryan has had over the years, probably maybe a handful has only converted into like a directing gig in one of his shows. Very low conversion rate, as is with most fellowships and most programs. But what I discovered, and what the reason why I'm still doing them and why I'm still very adamant of them being beneficial, is that you have those meetings with those people where you tell them, I was in Ryan Murphy, and they immediately take you more seriously.
Yeah.
And it immediately changes the tone of the conversation, or it gets you into meetings because you have that pat in the back from all these different organizations and all these different people, where Ryan gets thousands of applications every year. In my year, which was here 2019, I think when I saw the list of names, there was probably like 16 or 18 of us that got in throughout the whole year. So it's like, you're cutting through the noise, and your work is cutting through the noise. And for managers and agents and producers and all these people, that matters. So yes, maybe you're not going to come out of Ryan Murphy with an episode directing for Ryan Murphy Television, but it's going to get you meetings. And I was able to leverage the fact that I had gotten into Ryan Murphy to get an agent.
Yeah.
So I had already been accepted to Ryan Murphy when I got my meeting with my agent, with the prospective agent at that point. And just because I was like, look, I have this coming up, I've already been, this happened, and this is going to like be a thing on my resume. And that's when my agent, I think it was a huge decision maker point for her to sign me.
Yeah.
So people get frustrated, and I understand the frustration of fellowships and programs, and it's like, I've done all of them. You keep telling me that if I do them that I'm gonna be okay, and not necessarily. But I've seen how it affects and how just your whole list of credentials gets elevated by having those kind of things on them, and how you get taken more seriously at meetings. So even if it doesn't necessarily translate into a job immediately, I think it definitely helps in you getting jobs in the future.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's totally true. Because, I have some friends who like have been through some of those, and it's like, and they're still hustling. Like, it's not like, like, oh, I know that person. I know they're still hustling. Like, I'm pretty sure I would hear if they were like directing American Horror Story, but it's like, it's also not a bad thing to have.
Not at all.
On like your bio, on your resume, and like just whatever.
It doesn't detract from it. It only adds from it.
Yeah.
So if you can do a fellowship, do it. Yeah. If you get into a program, take it. None of them outside of Ryan Murphy that I know of pay. So a lot of these fellowships are, and I think it's one of the conversations that I've been having in the community lately is, specifically Latino women, we get paid less than everyone else. Yeah. So for a fellowship to ask us already, when we're already financially burdened, to take 3 weeks off work so that we can come be with you. Yeah. That's also a very restrictive factor coming into, you have to take 3 weeks off work or quit your work entirely because you need to take 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks off to come be in this fellowship, and we're not going to give you a dime. Yeah.
And it also, I think that also leads to the frustration of then, it's like, then what did I get out of it?
Right.
Because it's like, I quit my job. Right. Like, this was supposed to be my ticket in.
And it wasn't.
Yeah. Now I'm like.
So Ryan is the only fellowship that I know of that has a stipend. So they do give you a stipend. It's not a lot. They do give you a stipend that is, about a month worth salary and very average range. Yeah. But it's a flat rate. So you could be shadowing for 6 weeks. You could be shadowing for 3 weeks. It's still going to be the same amount. So it's just one flat rate. And then all of the other fellowships are unpaid, and none of them have a guarantee of anything at the end. Yeah. So you're like, well, fuck. Yeah. And a lot of them, for example, there's this huge fellowship, which is AFI's directing workshop, that you have to, they don't charge you for it, but you have to take time off work. And they're also like, well, you're expected to put in like $30,000 or $20,000 to make a short film. Okay, cool. Yeah. Congratulations.
Yeah, it is interesting how all these like opportunities they get you in the industry, that it's like
they come with a price tag.
Yeah, and it's like if you just can't afford to do it, then it's like, and then to like a larger point, it's like, well, then like, is this fellowship doing what it's supposed to be doing? Right. Right. Because there's very real barriers for entry, and it's like, let's just add to that, or let's just like match those.
Women of color can't take 3 weeks off work.
No.
They just can't. So then, or women of color don't necessarily have the networks to take 3 weeks of work and also raise $30,000 to shoot your short film.
Yeah.
So that you can screen it in front of CAA and I may or may not get signed.
Yeah. And like, that's if you're like even single and have no kids.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
It's like, oh, I'm just going to go to LA for 3 weeks. It's like,
Right.
okay, we'll have to worry about child care also. Like,
and a lot of them, just do restrict you to being like an LA resident, but the ones that don't are like, we don't pay for flights, we don't pay for lodging, you have to come for 3 weeks. So you're just, even if it's an indirect price tag, there is a price tag to all these diversity programs that are supposed to diversify the industry, but they really don't, because people of color are disproportionately at a disadvantage financially from the start.
Yeah. A lot of work to be done.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to ask anything that you're working on that, you're excited about, anything that it's like in the works, or just even like in general, like something that's like in your brain that you're just like, oh, I really want to like get into this, or like tell this story.
I mean, like I said, I pitched at my dream production company a couple weeks ago, and I pitched several ideas, but they were very, very excited about one of my sci-fi features and one of my sci-fi pilots. So I'm in the process of writing those, because I went in having nothing written, and I walked out of the meeting of them being like, we want to read this, we want to read this, we want to read this, and I was like, great, now I have to write like 7 scripts. Congratulations, Chris. So I've been in the process of doing that, and then I went to pitch to a studio, and they were like, come back to us. They didn't ask me, thank God, to write the full script, but they're like, give us a 3-page treatment, and if we like it, then we'll order the script, like, and we'll pay you to write the script. So those are the 3 things that are at the top of my list right now that my agent hates me for not having gotten to her yet, because it's been a while. But I just keep jumping back and forth between, like, I'll write 10 pages of like the feature, and then I'm like, oh, I had this great idea for the pilot, but then I'm also working on another pilot, and I'll just switch gears for like a week and go write this other thing. So I think those 2, the sci-fi pilot and the sci-fi feature, and then the other pilot that I'm working on, are just kind of like very, very excited, and I think very distinctive voices and distinctive stories, all with Afro-Latina queer leads, because if we don't write them, who will?
And if someone else does, I don't want to see it.
Exactly. So yeah, I've made it a point. I'm writing a story with a trans friend right now, and I came in very honestly, and I told them, look, we're giving you, like, the lead is a trans non-binary character, and that's their representation. But we're not doing this unless their love interest is a Latina woman. Ideally Afro-Latina, I'll settle for just Latina. And so that's like, I'm very much making it a point out there. In my stories, I haven't written a male lead in years, because I just don't have the time. Let the white men write it.
There's plenty out there.
I'm writing it. So if you don't want to pick it up because my story is a queer Black Latina, then I'm sorry for you. You're missing out. I'll find someone who does it.
So I ask, I love to like ask writers about who they admire, who they're passionate about. So I wanted to know, like, writers who are heroes of yours, friends, people you're stalking on Instagram, just anybody whose work you're excited about right now.
2 people that I think I would love to have careers that emulate them, even though one of them leans more towards fantasy than I necessarily want to, but the infamous Javier Grillo Marsouch. I always butcher his last name. I think that's how you say it.
I've never said it out loud. So.
You like, out of fear, but you put me on the spot, and I was like, I'm just going to take a stab at it. And Roberto Orsi. So Roberto was one of the co-creators with J.J. Abrams on one of my favorite shows, which is Fringe, and Javi worked on Lost, which is another of my favorite shows. So I think those 2 men live in an area where I would very much love to exist in. There's rarely any women who write for genre sci-fi I want to be there, but there's definitely no Afro-Latinas writing in like the genre world right now. And I would love for that to be me. So I think having careers where you're creating transcendental shows like Lost or Fringe and all these other things that they've been involved in. As every writer, they've had some great shows, they've had some not so great shows, so not hopefully staying away from the not so great ones, but I think those two men are very, very capable Latino writers that are very proud of being Latino and are doing some great work for our representation, for sure.
Yeah. All right, cool.
Yeah.
And sort of like my last question that I ask everybody is, I always ask my guests to title their episode. So the prompt is a blank Latinx writer. So in that blank, you can put whatever you want, whatever feels real to your identity, the type of work you do, even just like this conversation, just to like have people see the title and think, oh, that's like me. Let me listen to it. And so whatever comes to mind, there's no wrong answer. And
there's no wrong answer. What if there's just no? I'm terrible at this.
And I also lied. This is the hardest question. I just don't tell people because I don't want to psych them out.
It's the moment you asked me to talk about it's funny because I just spent like an hour talking about myself. But the moment you're like, okay, but now specifically, like write a bio.
Truly,
like,
though.
I don't. Don't want to do it. I don't know. God. It's just like, it's so cliche to be like a sci-fi Latino writer, but because I don't think that I only do sci-fi. And when people, I think there's a very strong misconception about what sci-fi is. Or I think when people think of sci-fi, they think of like one specific type of sci-fi, which is like Star Wars, Battlestar, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of other types of sci-fi, which is what I relate to. I don't necessarily relate to the Battlestars and that kind of thing. So I'm always wary about using the sci-fi label. Can I just be like an Afro-Latina writer? Because there's not that many of us.
There's
fine. Very few of us.
And I'm sure you'll get a lot of love for that too.
Yeah.
People will be like, that's me too.
Yeah. So I'm just an Afro-Latina writer.
Great.
Please come introduce yourself if you're Afro-Latinas and if you're a writer, because I genuinely think that there's none of us in the industry, not even just in sci-fi or genre. There's no Afro-Latinas in the director's chair, in the writer's chair, in executive positions or anything like that. And I was part of a conversation very recently. It was kind of like a caucus of Latino diversity that was actually held by a professor at Emerson. And she just brought in all these activists, because I've been doing quite a bit of like activism lately in terms of diversity. And one of the points that I brought up is within the Latino community, the 5 biggest Latino demographics in the U.S. are Mexican, Guatemalan, or Salvadorian. I can never remember which one. But then Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Dominican. But you don't ever, like, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans, Cubans not so much, but Puerto Ricans and Dominicans specifically are predominantly Afro-Latinos. By, like, a vast majority. But you don't see Afro-Latinos represented ever. Whatsoever. So it's like, not only is just like within the Latino community itself, we're invisible, and the Latino community already is invisible. So this is something that I'm really, really passionate about being a voice for and being a face for, because we're just non-existent. Yeah, I mean, I feel like within like the last 2-3 years, like Afro-Latinx, like even within our own community, we're like, oh, okay, like they exist. And it's like, they've been here. We've been here. We are real. And you know, even speaking back to like, you know, like undocumented, like Latinx people, like, so I was listening to this podcast about, you know, like undocumented folk, and they were saying that, you know, out of all like undocumented folk, like maybe like 8% are Black, but they make up almost 20% of those detained by ICE. So, because we all know that, like, just like depending on the color of skin, you are policed more. People are asking for ID more. You're putting into you get put into like the criminal justice system. So there are a smaller population of undocumented folks, but they almost make up disproportionately. Yeah. And I think with the conversation that we were having, once I brought up this point of the invisibility of Afro-Latinos, even though we're disproportionately a number of Latinos in the community in the U.S. overall, is colorism.
Yeah.
And it comes into play all the time. I mean, love my grandfather very much, but the reason why I struggled with even identifying as Afro anything, and I would just call myself Dominican, and that's an issue that Dominicans have, where we call ourselves Dominican and not black.
Yeah.
But it's because I grew up listening to, you gotta marry white because you gotta clean the race, like you can't ruin the bloodline, blah 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 blah. And I was like, we're all black.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like, well, my mom's side, so I'm biracial. My mom's side of the family is white. My dad's side of the family is like indigenous and black. So, yes, my grandfather had that colorism in him, but like I've also heard it from darker people. It's like a thing in the Dominican Republic where it's like, you gotta marry, you can't ruin the bloodline, don't bring a black man home. We're black, mom. Like, or like those are the conversations that you hear, and you're like, if they're darker than you, do not bring them home.
Yeah, no, I was listening to this podcast, and this girl was talking about how she was dating a Dominican guy. They went back to the Dominican Republic, and everybody was like calling her black, and she was like, I thought we all are black. And they're like, no, we're Dominican. It's like, okay.
So Afro-Latinidad, I think it's something that's definitely in flux, and that conversations like this, or like hearing conversations like these, are what made me grow into my own Afro-Latino identity, because for the longest time I would refuse. I was never in my mind, was I black? I was just Dominican, and I look like my mom, who's like white with light eyes and light hair, and I look like my dad.
Yeah.
And for the I would get mad growing up if you would tell me that I look like my dad, because I grew up with that idea of like, well, that's the bad side of the family. I gotta look like the white side of the family.
Yeah.
And I think hearing more from Afro-Latinos is I think a very vital part of what our conversation as Latinos need to be, because we're here, we're present, and we exist.
Yeah. And, you know, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on like representation and conversations. And that's why I love the title of your episode, because I'm also looking to like interview more like Afro-Latinx people.
Yeah.
And funny enough, more have reached out to me in the last 2 months than like the whole time I've been doing this. So please DM me, be on the podcast. I want to hear from you.
Please, if you're Afro-Latinos, let's like start a writers group or something.
I mean,
whatever it is.
If you want to do like an Afro-Latinx writers podcast, go for it. Like,
please.
It could be the spinoff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where can people find you? What's your social media?
I'm everywhere as my own name, which is Kryzz Gautier, at Kryzz Gautier, and that is KRYZZ, Chris. Yeah. And last name is Gautier, Gautier. All
right. And you can find us at La Lista Podcast on Instagram and Twitter, giving our plug. So thank you so much for coming on.
Of course. It was great.
I love these conversations because you never